Joakim was sitting waiting on a wooden bench outside a low building at the district hospital in Kalmar. The weather was cold and sunny. Beside him sat a young hospital chaplain. Joakim was refusing to go in. He had seen Ethel in a room like this the previous year. He lowered his eyes and silently shook his head. Eventually the junior doctor nodded. "Wait here then, it'll take a little while." She went into the building. After a few minutes she came back with some Polaroid photographs. She held out the photographs to Joakim. They were close-ups of Katrine's face. Her skin was white and lifeless, and she had small wounds on her forehead and on one cheek. "She's injured," he said quietly. "It's from the fall," said the doctor. She slipped on the rocks out on the jetty and hit her face before she ended up in the water. "But she drowned?" It was hypothermia, the shock of the cold water. She took water into her lungs when she went below the surface. "But she fell in the water," said Joakim. "Why did she fall?" Joakim woke up with a start. The sound that had woken him up was no dream. It was Livia calling out, "Mummy!" The clock by the side of the bed was showing 3:15. "Mummy!" She raised her head when he bent over her bed. He stroked her forehead without saying anything. "Mummy," she mumbled. An idea suddenly came into his head. He crept out of the door and into the dark bathroom. He groped his way to the wooden laundry basket. The basket was almost full. Nobody had done any washing for almost a week. Most of the items were hers. Joakim pulled out a red woolen sweater. He went past Gabriel's room and back into Livia's. She had kicked off the coverlet and was waking up. "Sleep now, Livia," said Joakim. "Mummy's here." He placed Katrine's thick sweater close to Livia's face and pulled the coverlet up to her chin. "Hmm?" She mumbled something in her sleep and gradually relaxed. The danger was past, and Joakim knew that next morning she wouldn't even remember that she had been awake. He drove the children into Manus at around 8 each morning, away from the silence of Eel Point. "Bye, Daddy," said Livia when he left her at preschool. "Is Mummy coming home tonight?" "No, not tonight," he said, "but I'll come and pick you up." Livia ran off to join the other children. At the same time, a grey-haired woman looked out of the cloakroom. It was Marianne, the head of the preschool unit. "If you didn't already know, I was the one who found her in the water." Joakim had no questions, but she carried on talking anyway, as if she needed to tell him. "There was no answer when I telephoned, so I put them in my car and drove out to Eel Point. The children ran into the house, but the place was silent and empty. I went out looking, and then I saw something red down in the water by the lighthouses, a red jacket." "The children weren't there? They didn't see Katrine?" "No, they were still in the house. Then I took them over to the neighbours. They didn't see anything." Tilda and Gerlof were back in his room, and her tape recorder was up and running once again. Gerlof was talking about his early days as a teenage skipper on the Baltic. Tilda thought again about the information she'd got wrong the previous week and asked, "What do you know about the manor house at Eel Point, Gerlof?" "Eel Point? Your grandfather was a neighbour." "Was he?" "His cottage was a mile or so further north. Ragnar used to fish for eels off the point, and he was a watchman for the lighthouses." "Are there any stories about the place?" "Well, the manor house does have something of a reputation. They say that the foundations are made of granite from an old abandoned chapel." "Why is there only a light in one tower?" said Tilda. "There was some kind of accident there. I think it was a fire. I suppose it got too expensive to have them both working every night." "I was at the house last week," she said. "Someone drowned." In the end, Tilda told him most of it. She drowned straight away, despite the fact that the water is shallow there.
"Not everywhere. It's deeper out by the jetty. I've seen sailing boats moored there. Did anyone see it happen?"
Tilda shook her head. Gerlof got up with some difficulty and went over to the desk. He took a black notebook out of one of the drawers.
"I always make a note of the weather, he said. He flicked through to the page he wanted. There was hardly any wind that day.
Yes, I suppose it was. It was calm out at Eel Point.
So no waves can have raced up the shore and wiped out any traces, said Gerloff.
No. And the footprints from the woman's shoes were still there in the sand. I saw them myself.
Was she injured in any way?
I only saw her briefly, but she had a small wound on her forehead.
A graze?
Yes. It was probably from the fall. She probably hit her head on the stone jetty when she fell.
Gerloff slowly sat down again. Any enemies?
What?
Did she have any enemies, the woman who drowned?
Tilda sighed. Do mothers with small children usually have mortal enemies here on the island?
What about from the sea? If someone came along the coast in a boat and moored by the jetty on Eel Point, then there wouldn't be any footprints in the sand.
Tilda sighed. OK, so I'd better start looking for a boat then. She looked at him and asked, Gerloff, are you finding these recordings difficult?
Gerloff hesitated. I find it a bit difficult to talk about relatives who have died, he said eventually. It feels as if they're sitting and listening.
It's mostly grandfather I want to talk about, said Tilda.
I know, but he might be listening too.
Was he hard work as an older brother, Ragnar?
He had his moments.
I don't remember him, said Tilda. Dad never talked about him.
Ragnar, he froze to death in a winter storm, Gerloff went on. The body was found on the shore to the south of this cottage. Did your dad tell you that? Ragnar died in the snow.
Nobody is dead until they are warm and dead, said Tilda. People have been found frozen stiff and with no pulse in snowdrifts. But they've come back to life when they've been brought into the warmth.
Who told you that?
Martin.
Martin? Who's he?
My boyfriend, said Tilda. He lives in Växjö. He's a teacher.
Nice, Gerloff smiled.
Everything seemed so simple when she was sitting here with Gerloff, talking about Martin. Not complicated at all. The funeral took place at 11 o'clock on a Thursday in Marnus Church. The children weren't there. Joakim had dropped them off at preschool, as usual, at 8 o'clock, without saying anything. It was 2 minutes to 11 when the church door opened and a tall, broad-shouldered woman strode in. She was wearing a black coat and a black veil, which concealed her eyes, but her lips were painted with bright red lipstick. Her heels echoed on the stone floor, and many heads turned in the church. The woman marched up and sat down in the pew at the front on the right, next to Katrine's 4 half-sisters and brothers. She was their mother and Katrine's mother, Mira Ramba, Joakim's mother-in-law, the artist and singer. He hadn't seen Mira since their wedding 7 years earlier. In contrast to that particular day, she appeared to be sober now. Just as Mira sat down, the bells began to toll up in the church tower. Finally, it was evening again, and he was back at Eel Point. Inside the house, Livia and Gabriel were being put to bed by their grandmother. Lisa and Michael Heslin were standing by their car out at the front. It was late, and they had a long journey back to Stockholm, but they had still come back to the house with him. "Thanks for coming," said Joakim. "No problem," said Michael, placing his black suit in its plastic covering on the back seat. There was a tense silence. "Come up to Stockholm soon," said Lisa. "Or come over to Gotland with the children to our cottage." "Maybe." "We'll be in touch, Joakim," said Michael. Joakim nodded. The November night was dry, but it was cold, dark, and foggy. Perfect weather for break-ins. The house lay up on a ridge and had been built recently. The sliding door to the ground floor was made of glass, fastened with a simple catch. Like a commando, Tommy Aurelius indicated with a hand signal that they should split up, and Hendrik went into a living room with a leather sofa. There was something large and shiny under there. It was an old hunting gun with a polished wooden butt and a shoulder strap of well-oiled leather. A small red cardboard box containing cartridges lay beside it. Hendrik slipped it over his shoulder. Freddie was busy carrying out an exercise bike. They heard a thud in the darkness, followed by footsteps from upstairs. Then the light on the staircase was switched on.
Hello? Called a man's voice. They all took to their heels at the same time. Load up, shouted Tommy, pulling off his hood and climbing in behind the wheel. Henrik and Freddie quickly pushed everything into the back of the van. Tommy floored the accelerator and the van shot away. "We must do that again," said Freddie once they were out on the main road. "What's this?" said Tommy. He had discovered the gun. "I found it in the house," said Henrik. "It's an old Mauser," said Tommy. "Collectors love this sort of thing." "Not too many more," said Hendrik when they were back on the road. "What?" "These trips. I can't cope with many more." "We have to do a few more." "2," said Hendrik. "I'll go out with you twice more." "OK, where?" Hendrik was silent behind the wheel. "A couple of places I know," he said. "A priest's house, where there could be some jewellery, and maybe the manor house at Eel Point." Manya was standing by his desk, tucking into sandwiches. "Hans, could you spare a moment?" "Absolutely, Tilda. I'd really like to talk about your message." "What message?" "The message about the death at Eel Point. You recognise this, I presume?" She held up a piece of paper. 3 names were written in ink. The first was Livia Westin, the second was Katrine Westin, the third was Gabriel Westin. Next to Livia's name was a cross. "So," said Manya, "you were supposed to mark the name of the person who drowned. That's what I asked you to do." Manya was no longer smiling. "And you put the cross in front of Livia Westin's name?" "Yes." "And it was the mother, Katrine Westin, who had drowned?" Manya seemed completely uninterested in the conversation. "OK," he said, "a mistake. Even the police make a mistake sometimes." "Yes, but it was your mistake," said Tilda, "not mine." "Remember," said Inspector Guter Homblad, as they pulled up in front of the house at Eel Point, "you don't have to say anything if you don't want to." Tilda nodded. The door opened. Joakim Westin nodded at Homblad, but didn't acknowledge Tilda. They followed him in. "Coffee?" asked Westin. "Thank you. That would be good," said Homblad. Homblad adjusted his uniform. "We'd very much like to start by saying that this sort of thing simply shouldn't happen." "You've got that right," said Westin. "I thought my daughter had drowned. I thought that for several hours." "As I said, our sincere regrets," said Homblad. "How's the investigation going?" asked Westin. "The investigation? Into my wife's death?" "There is no investigation," said the inspector quickly. "In this case, there are no grounds for suspicion. She walked right to the end of the jetty and jumped into the water." "Nobody's saying it was suicide," said Homblad. Tilda looked out of the window towards the lighthouses and the sea. She thought about Gerloff. "Did your wife have any enemies?" she asked suddenly. Joakim Westin seemed surprised by the question. "No," he said. "Neither of us has any enemies." "So she hadn't been threatened by anyone here on the island?" Westin shook his head. When Guter Homblad had finished his coffee, he got up from the table. "Of course," he said, "you are at liberty to pursue this matter. I want you to know that, but—" Westin shook his head. "I won't be taking it any further." One day at a time. They never talked about it, but Livia and Gabriel seemed to be under the impression that their mother had simply gone away and would be back. It wasn't good, but at the same time Joachim had almost begun to believe it himself. The weekend came. The children were at home, playing in Livia's room. Joachim was going to start wallpapering the room in the southwest corner. He had set up a table and mixed a bucket of wallpaper paste after breakfast. He wasn't going to think, he was just going to wallpaper. When he had put up the first 4 lengths, Joachim suddenly heard a faint thudding noise. He went over to the window facing out from the back of the house and opened it. A boy was standing on the grass down below, perhaps a year or 2 older than Livia. At his feet he had a yellow plastic football. "Hi," said Joachim. "What's your name?" "Andreas." "Where do you live?" "Over there." He pointed towards the farm. So Andreas was one of the Carlson family's children. "Would you like to come in?" said Joachim. "You can say hello to Livia and Gabriel," said Joachim. "They're my children." "Livia's the same age as you." Andreas nodded. "For a little while. We'll be eating soon." He picked up his ball and disappeared around the side of the house. Joachim closed the window and went out of the room. Livia! Gabriel! We've got a visitor!
Andreas walked into the porch, took off his outdoor clothes and dropped them on the floor. Andreas looked at Livia and she looked back. "You could kick the football around for a while," said Joakim. "I know a great room you could use." He led the way into the house with the children following along behind. They came to the large drawing room, which was still almost completely unfurnished. There were just a few cardboard boxes on the floor. "You can play in here," said Joakim, stacking 3 of the boxes in front of the window to protect it. He loved the happy noises spreading through the house. But when only a couple of feet of unpapered wall remained, he realized that the echoing children's laughter could no longer be heard from the drawing room. The house was completely silent again. "Livia!" he called. "Gabriel! Would you like some juice and biscuits?" No reply. Halfway to the drawing room, he looked out of the window into the courtyard. The door to the big barn was standing ajar. Then he saw that Andreas Carlsson's outdoor clothes had gone from the floor. Joakim went across and stopped in the doorway of the barn. "Hello?" No reply. Were they playing hide-and-seek? Nothing was moving inside the barn, but Joakim thought he could hear a tapping or creaking noise from the hayloft, up above, like footsteps. A narrow, steep wooden staircase led up to the loft, and he grabbed hold of the sides and began to climb. The winter wind was like a faint whisper above the roof of the barn. He didn't really like being alone up here in the cold. "Livia!" he shouted. The wooden floor creaked in front of him, but he got no other answer. He looked around and listened. "Katrine?" he said quietly. No reply. When he got back into the house, he found his children were where he should have looked in the first place, in Livia's bedroom. "Did you go outside? You and Andreas and Gabriel?" "For a little while." "You mustn't go in the barn," said Joakim. "Did you hide in there?" "No. There's nothing to do in the barn." "Where's Andreas?" "He went home." "Mommy!" Livia's voice made Joakim raise his head, wide awake. The clock radio was showing 23:52. He had slept for an hour. "Mommy!" Livia was lying under the covers with her eyes closed, but Joakim could see her head moving restlessly on the pillow. "Mummy isn't here," he said quietly. "Yes, she is." "Go to sleep now, Livia." She opened her eyes and recognized him. "I can't sleep, Daddy." "Yes, you can." "No," said Livia. "You have to sleep here." Joakim sighed, but Livia was wide awake now, and there was nothing else for it. Cautiously, he lay down on the edge of the bed. It was too short. He'd never be able to get to sleep. He fell asleep after 2 minutes. There was someone outside the house. Joakim opened his eyes in the darkness. He couldn't hear anything, but he could feel that they had a visitor. What time was it? He had no idea. He sat up silently and carefully got off the bed. But after only 3 steps, he heard the voice behind him. "Don't go, Daddy." He stopped and turned around. "Why not?" "Don't go." Joakim couldn't see her face, just her blonde hair. "Are you asleep, Livia?" he asked quietly. "No." "Are you sleeping?" "No, I can see things." "Where?" "In the wall." "What can you see?" "Lights, water, shadows." "Can you see any people?" She was silent again. Before the reply came, "Mummy." Don't ask any more questions, he thought. Go to bed. But he had to carry on. "Where can you see Mummy?" he asked. "Behind the light. Everybody's standing there waiting. And Mummy's with them." "Who? Who's waiting?" She didn't reply. "How's Mummy feeling?" "She's sad." "Sad?" "She wants to come in." "Tell her..." Joakim swallowed, his mouth dry. "Tell her she can come in any time." "She can't." Joakim spoke slowly and clearly. "Can you ask Mummy what she was doing down by the water?" Livia lay motionless in the bed. There was no response. But he still didn't want to give up. "Livia, can you talk to Mummy?" "She wants to come in." "You must try." "She wants to talk," Livia broke in. "Does she?" he asked. "About what?" What does Mummy want to say? But Livia said nothing more. Joakim said nothing either. He returned silently to his own bed. A Friday night at the end of November. The big vicarage at Haggleby lay at the end of a forest track half a mile or so outside the village. Hendrik and the Sørelius brothers had parked their van in a grove of trees up by the main road. Hendrik had drunk more beer than usual. His nerves were at breaking point tonight. It was all the fault of the Sørelius brothers' Ouija board. They had conducted a quick session in Hendrik's kitchen at around 11 o'clock. Freddie had lit the candles. Tommy placed his index finger on the glass. "Is anybody there?" The glass began to move straight away. Tommy leaned forward. "Is it Alistair?" The glass moved over to the letter A, then L. "He's here," said Tommy quietly. But the glass carried on to G, then to O, and T, then it stopped. "Algot," said Tommy. Hendrik stiffened. The glass had begun to move across the board again, and he wrote down what it was spelling out. Algot, not good, alone, Hendrik, not good, not living, not good, Hendrik, not... Hendrik stopped writing. "I can't do this anymore," he said. It was 12:30 when they finally arrived at the vicarage. It was a cloudy night and the house was in darkness. Hendrik was still pondering over the board's message. Algot? His grandfather's name had been Algot. "Let's go," said Tommy. "Abba baba." He led the way up the stone path and the steps. Then he leaned forward and peered thoughtfully at the lock. "Looks pretty solid," he whispered. Hendrik shook his head. "This is the country," he whispered back. He reached out, silently pushed down the handle. It wasn't locked. They were in a big, dark hallway. There were 3 doors leading off the hallway, 2 of them ajar. Tommy opted for the right-hand one. Hendrik followed him. He could hear Freddie's breathing and heavy footsteps right behind him. The door led into a drawing room. Tommy opened a bureau. Hendrik caught sight of something tall and narrow in one of the windows. It was some kind of old lantern, with panes of glass and lacquered wood, perhaps 12 inches high and 6 inches wide. Rather charming. It would go nicely in his flat if a fence didn't want to buy it. He wrapped a tablecloth around the lantern and pushed it into his rucksack. There was no sign of Freddie when they emerged into the hallway. Had he gone further into the house? A door opened slowly. It was the door leading to the kitchen, and Henry was so sure it was Freddie that he didn't even turn his head. But suddenly he heard Tommy gasp. Hendrik turned and saw a white-haired gnome standing in the doorway. "What are you doing?" "I'm calling the police." Tommy pushed him back into the kitchen. The old man dropped his glasses as he stumbled in the doorway and collapsed just inside. Tommy followed him. There was something sharp in his hand, a knife or a screwdriver. "That's enough!" Hendrik hurried over to try and stop Tommy, but stumbled over a rag rug and ended up standing on the old man's hand with his heavy boot. There was a crunching sound. "Come on!" somebody shouted, perhaps Hendrik himself. Hendrik stumbled backwards and banged into the marble table in the hallway. The big mirror fell to the floor with a series of crashes. Everything was blurred, like on a dance floor, fast and unplanned. Then he heard a high-pitched voice behind him. He saw a woman standing by the man on the floor. She was even shorter and looked terrified. "Gunnar," she called, bending down. "Gunnar, I've called the police." Hendrik fled, through the veranda and out into the night. Hendrik ran across the grass and into the forest. Something grabbed hold of his foot, and suddenly he was flying through the air, straight down into the shadows, where the wet leaves and undergrowth received him. Something hit the back of his head hard. The night became blurred. He felt really bad. When Hendrik came to, he was crawling on all fours, aiming for a black shadow that was growing up ahead of him, a little cave. He crept in through the opening and curled up. Someone was after him, but in here he was safe. It took several minutes for his mind to clear. He raised his head and looked around. Silence. Total darkness. Where had he ended up? He felt earth beneath his fingers and realized that he had crawled into an old stone-covered cellar in the forest near the vicarage. It was cold and damp. It smelt of fungus, kind of mouldy. Suddenly he got the idea that he was lying in an old death chamber, an earth cellar for the dead, where they lay waiting to be buried over in the graveyard. Hendrik slowly crawled out of the cellar and set off through the undergrowth. Suddenly he heard a van door slam. He listened. An engine started up far away in the darkness. Hendrik moved more quickly through the trees, came out onto a broad path and began to run. He saw the Sørelius brothers' van. It was just reversing out onto the road. He got there just in time and tore open the side door. "What happened to you?" asked Tommy over his shoulder.
I got lost, said Hendrik.
It took them a good half hour to unload everything and hide it in the boathouse, but it was worth it to feel safer. All Hendrik had left in his rucksack when they got back was the old glass lantern. "We'll take a break," said Tommy as they reached the streetlights of the town. "A little bit of time off." "Okay," said Hendrik. "We'll be in touch," said Tommy through the open window of the van. It was difficult to get to sleep. His forehead was aching and his nerves were buzzing throughout his body, but sometime after 4 he drifted off. A couple of hours later, Hendrik was woken by the sound of knocking in the apartment. The knocking was coming from his rucksack. 3 knocks, then silence, then a couple more knocks. He bent down and unzipped the bag. The old lantern from the vicarage was inside, still wrapped in the tablecloth. Hendrik lifted it out. The wooden frame of the lantern had cooled down in the van, presumably. Now it was getting back up to room temperature. That's why it was clicking and knocking. He placed the lantern on the kitchen table, closed the door and went back to bed. The sound of faint knocking could be heard from the kitchen. It was just as irritating as a dripping tap.